Okay. Este yun especial na Pulan Chamoru na episode Fanachu. We host Midzu para este episode si Maga'låhan Bavakwa. Unganan. This is a Pulan Chamoru, or as most people call it today, Mes Chamoru, Chamorro month episode. And this this is really there was other episodes that were planned for this week, but I've dispensado sa Gaigizugi San Lago. I'm traveling. Other arrangements were originally made for an episode for this week. They weren't able to happen. So I've pulled this together at the last second as sort of to help fill the space. And because this is Pulan Chamoru, Mes Chamoru, a time for celebrating things that are tomorrow. One of the things that are most requested from Fanachu, from our patrons, from our listeners, from our viewers, are more things related to Chamorro language and culture and history. And so with this in mind, I decided to have an episode related to Lihenden Chamoru, Chamorro legends. And so what I'll be doing for this episode today is that I will be sharing 3 Chamorro legends in the Chamorro language. And as you can already tell by the flyer here, and you can already tell by my background behind me, that gives you a clue as to what some of the legends might be. And before we get started, if you are a follower of Fanachu, if you are a patron, and por favor, remember that if you love deep dives, further study and more information on Chamorro history, culture, and language, then you may want to sign up to become a patron on Patreon to support Fanachu, because then you get access to the Radical Reading series and the Secret Guam podcast. Because today we're going to be talking about 3 Chamorro legends. But if you want to talk about Chamorro legends and you want to know about alternative versions of Chamorro legends, and you want to know about Chamorro legends that are no longer told, or Chamorro legends that are mentioned in passing, or Chamorro legends that may have been disavowed at this point, you may want to check out those segments, and those are only available for those who support Fanachu by subscribing and signing up on Patreon. And so www.patreon.com/Fanachu, and signing up for Hatsa, Hugwa, or Tulu level support. You get free t-shirts, stickers. You also, if you sign up as a Hugwa or Tulu level patron, then you get access to the Secret Guam podcast and Radical Readings. And so if you are interested in Chamorro legends, there are so many more. Sometimes people ask me, like, why don't we have more legends? And my response is, actually, we have far more than most people realize. It's just that over time, what's happened is that only certain stories get written down, and only certain stories, which from families, from villages, from islands, become sort of hegemonic or rise to the point where they come to represent something larger than where they started from. And this is not something that's from colonization. This is something that's normal. And so there's always way more than what your average community remembers actively. And so in the Secret Guam podcast, for example, there's a whole series which talk about legends that are not actively recounted anymore, not actively known. I did one last year which talked about how a legend of the Virgin Mary, and how she brought a plague to Guam, to a village which refused to acknowledge her and Christianity, and how she cursed that village. All sorts of legends like that, which we can understand if you're familiar with Guam's history, if you're knowledgeable about it, then it makes sense. But actually, it makes sense why people might tell that legend. But then you can also then understand why that legend might get cut out, because it's not GDOE curriculum standards friendly, or it's not Guam Visitors Bureau friendly. So at a certain point, legends that don't quite fit get put to the side. And so in those series, we talk about those types of legends. And I enjoy it because we really get into as much as we can, given the limited resources that we have from oral history, but also textual archival resources. We try to unpack and unravel as much as we can about sort of the legends, the folklore, the mythology, the cosmology of the Chamorro people. But so for today, though, we're focusing on three legends which say different things. And so the first one is one which I always love to share with my Chamorro language students. It is the the Chamorro version of Cinderella. The Chamorro version of Cinderella. And so this is why, when we talk about legends, oftentimes people think, oh, legends, thinking back to ancient times, even at legends that have ancient elements. We have to remember that most likely what happened in the 1800s, there was this big filter in which Chamorros were undergoing this process in which they were becoming very much influenced by and connected to sort of their place in the Spanish Empire. And so new stories were coming in. They were, you know, and so this shows up in the folklore, is that Chamorros develop their own stories that are connected to stories that come from other places in the world, right? Serena is the most famous example of that. And so there, so there are Chamorro versions, for example, of Pinocchio, Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, stuff like this. There's lots of them because these were stories that came in, different families had their own versions of them. And then some of them achieved a different character where more people might have told them. And then most of them just disappeared, replaced by other stories. Many of them replaced by Grimm's fairy tales, Western stories, American stories, Disney stories, and so on. But here we go. This is the Chamorro version of Cinderella, which you can find in Spoken Chamorro by Donald Topping. And I'm going to read it in Chamorro. I'm not going to translate it into English. And so if you are somebody who is studying Chamorro, trying to learn Chamorro, just listen. You can pause, you can go back, and you can, translate words, listen with somebody else, and so you can try to translate what's being said. But we're just going to read it, and we're just going to keep it Chamorro. Okay. Atmam na champugi tsagu na lugat, manyasga un tata un nana zan dos na hoben na patgun Palawan. I unu gof bonita, i otro ti bonita. I bonita na anya si Hidda, i otro na anya si Matilde. Esti bonita na patgun tisan sumetlo zan i otro. I asagwanya esti tatanya ti nananya i bonita na Palawan. Matay na anya i bonita. Umasgway tatanya tatlo. Esti ibiuda ni gay patgun ti bonita esti na patgun matay tata. Inanaha zani dos patgun gagaygi. Inana zani ti bonita na patgun ti magwaidza esti i bonita. I bonita hanagaskas i gima zaha preprensa todo i magago. Pas kada puengi matatsung si hit dagi kusina. Hahahasu si tatanya ni matay. Tadzanay magufgwi. Tadzanay guaha nuebu na tininanya. Ibiuda zan esti iti bonita na patgonya bula nuebu na sininaniha. Sesu humano i dos gumuput. Po gusihit da sumasaga gigima zahatsotso guitoru itsetsu siha. Guanay mananaha timonadzan hatso guitoru itsetsu siha. Zaganesta oran sumotsu sihita hanatzan nenkano gilamasa. Haagang idos tsumotsu. Tisinya esti bonito na patgon sumotsu este ki monadzani bi udadzani patgonya. Pazangan guaha sobla nenkunu gilamasa I bonito na patgon hakanu. Pazangan tadza sobla pasti tsumotsu gui. Mampus ti mamagov gui gigima. Kada monadzani tsatsotnya sia si hida humano asti hadinya. Zahaata ni mambonita na flores. Undiha matu un bonitun paluma za tumogi ki flores hita. Pues esti paluma haaten si hita za pues hatutuhun kumanta. En ay manadza ni kantanya gumupu hasta itzagonya na lugat. Si hita hatatizi esti paluma. En ay matugwi gifioni paluma, esti paluma, gumupu tatlo. Guaha buenti jesbiain na gumugupu ha esti paluma. Este ki matugwi gi unguma. Pues si hita halii lokwi esti igima. En ay matugwi guatu hababa petani gima. Bula salapi mamodong ginini hilu pota. Pues septun gitsininonya. Gof bonita itsininonya. Malago gui tate aste igima. Niha zahasangani ibi uda zani patgonya. Ibi uda zani patgonya gof malago na umalii adzu na guma anay guaha salapi. Pues matago si hit na parokoni idos guatu hasta adzu na guma. Si hita mampus maulek na patgon zadzanya lokwi na esti idosu guahat sini na niha salape. Akoni siya guatu aste adzu igima na man motu siya si hita humano aste ipeta zapas hababa isalapi tatlu sigi matsuda ginini sanhilu ipeta. Si hita hatsuli esti isalapi zahapotlu gisanhizum igima. Esti ibiuda zani patgonya anay malii esti gof magof. Malagwi dos guatu asti peta za mababa. Loti salapi tumuno ginini peta. Sigi igef maipi na atkitran matsuda za senengi sia I dos esta ki matai I biuda zani patgonya. Pues esti I bonita na patgon sumaga. Guini na guma za mampus magof zan megay salapetnya. Torui champugogof magof guini naguma sabula esta amigunya. Right. Ispantazo. Asi idzo. Actually, because when this saved as a PDF, it took out a bunch of the lonats. Asi idzo. And I hutaitaita este huripaparanay na man mapus. So my apologies, actually, because a number of the lonats that were there when I typed this up have suddenly disappeared. And so when you read this, you will recognize some of the familiar and some of the similar parts of the Cinderella story, but you can also see how it's a little bit different. And so when these types of stories came to Guam, whether they came from, Spanish governors, or whether they came via whalers, or whether they came from political prisoners in the Marianas, however they came to Guam, we have to remember that they came with cultural traditions, landscapes, values from another part of the world. And what happened is that Chamorros would change them, sometimes in significant ways, sometimes in small ways, to make them fit. And so you can see that a little bit in this one, in that, that there is no glass slipper, for example, in this story. And for those of you who are fans of the Disney version, there's no pumpkin in this either. But there are birds, if you're a fan of the birds in the Cinderella story. And so there is boiling tar, though, interestingly enough. And so this is something that I like, because sometimes we tend to value the Chamorro stories only if they have only if they're super ancient, and we can say that this is a story that goes back thousands of years or 1,000 years or before colonization. And I think that those are very, very important. But I also adore stories that show the ways we're connected to other places, the ways that we took influences, we made them our own. And so, I'm not somebody who looks at this and says that, oh, ti Maga'låhi, ti Mes Chamoru esti. You know, I'm I like this story because you can see the way that it's clearly a story from somewhere else. But you could also see that this is a story that a Chamorro is trying to make fit with the lives in the Marianas and what we have in the Marianas at the same time. And so, lo, zaho, zaoesti. All right, uno manadan, dos tetetnan. And so we go from something which is, clearly European influenced to something which most people argue, of course, is ancient in origin. We're going to talk now, of course, about Gadao, who I put on the flyer for this episode, Gadao, Imaga'låhin Inalåhan. Si Maga'låhin Gadao, Imagas Inalåhan. And so this is a poem. If you like this poem, you don't have to take my word for it. You can go down to the big statue that I used in the image for this flyer, and this is there in both English and Chamorro. I'm going to read you the Chamorro. The English was written first. It was written by Judge Francisco Lujan, excuse me, and then it was later translated by a group of Chamorros. And so it's an interesting poem. So remember that it's an old story. It's an old story that comes with, that's attached to what's behind me here. The drawings Lidzangado. So it's the story of, of two chiefs, one from the north and one from the south, and how one is able to outwit and outsmart the other, who is so showy and proud and vain, and the other, by simply being quiet, more observant, and more calculating and strategic, is able to win the day. And so I love it. Love the Gadao story. And so let's get into this poem. All right, here we go. Fanekunguk manatungohu, ni historia ni baisangani hamzu. Kodos na magas guahan, ni sinya mafiges itangkat luluk. Zan madzamek imas donkulu na tronku, zangan matu binibuniha. Unu magas mafanan si malagwatnya, tautau tomhum, ifotunau na songsong. Gof mamta si malagwatnya, nagwidza mas metgut. Anoka gikulot lasasnya, zani salut tatautaunya. I otru na magas sigadau, tautau Inalåhan, asintadu na tautau, zan kapas gitodu klasen wegu, kontat ki magas I comunidad, anoklokwi I minet gotnya, gigat I kodunya, hahungok si malaguan tomhom, nagwahatautau at sa metgut. Giza Inalåhan, hagehilului itano zanitasi, hahanan para umumu idos, ni adzuna klasen mumu itadza na malii. Unpuengi hadingui sengsongnya, para umumu I atsamet gotnya. Hahanaugui itsago na tono Inalåhan, za matto gialas jes giegan. Hasodda sigadau kumadadu fanihi, za tiatungo hadzi itautau. Pasi malaguanyan tomhom umesalaw, monggi imetgut na magas midzu, ni malago na inmimu, be in afana pogu, sa hagatnya ni matsuda uni na agaga itasi. Si Gadaw Inalåhan manopi, time inaatnya. Hanaw abuk, suliidzu pontan, pastatsotsu fanihi, paikoni ha guatto gi mas takkilu na hefi, lo hano finetna guatto gi tronkun midzuk. Tigaf malago si malagwatnya, malagwatto gi tronku. Lo manosgia, za hadzengzung duru, za toru mamodung ipontan kalang utsan. Haadzekun pontan, za hafana i cosineru tatlu, lo tiene spanta si noble Gadaw, i kanainya kalang bolutan luluk. Hatsuli inidzuk, za hafigas ni unkanay, za isensa ni haigwas, za ni pinyot, mamodong kalang granyon unay, granyon unay, Spencer. Imagas tomhom ni na manman, Ruli este na graciosun tautaw, pero utsuli inidzuk za ufigas ni unkanainya. Siguro zu na imagasnya kof medgut na tautaw. Tibay mumud za ni mas magas pogu at tungohu. Ileknya malagwatnya. Kosinya put fabot, konidzu para igi mami tatlo. Gi anakku zan sadik na galaide. Guidza imaga Inalåhan victorioso, lo dididi sinanganya. Pasumano dos guato gi galaide, ni maaangkla gitasi. Inseguidas matsuli itilus, sinhafa, detention, lo timakpo igaraniha. Fenekongok ni hafa mas paisangan. Ihefen Inalåhan para uminaneha igalaide, sigun gitiningotnya, lo idos hefe matulus igalaide gikadakwat hinanaunya, za mapitatlu igalaide, paugu manatungohu, koman manamzu, tadza minagothu, za hamzu. Iespantau na malagwatnya matu hagigimatnya. Anay kahuhulu i atdaw. Hinangang anay hasodda na gwigwidza ha ki empigalaidi. Tisinya akumpara imetgotnya zan siha. Sa siha taigwihi i osu. Iti at burotau na hefe. Malii na duru matsotsu gisegenti diha. Manmangi gi atso. Gigimatnya gi lidzang. Gigimatnya gi holam lidzang gi kantantasi. Hatugi i estimatsagi i menatgotnya. Sadeka ganna imimoniha. Itauta ni manhahana Inalåhan. Gichempun patrosinu. Sinya malii itiningo. I mashulun na hefe. Gilidzang gi kantantasi. Gaigi historia per idanklo na mumu ni hagana si Gadaw gwihi na haani. Zahui estina poema na. The imagery, taimano mapega I imagery, I litrotusia, gi palabras na. So, of course, this was written by Judge Francisco Lujan, translated by Senator Pilar Lujan, Annie Stone, and Magdalena Taitanen. And so many people, don't even realize that there is the large statue there and that there is this beautiful poem there in English and in Chamorro as well. And so it has all these, and this is the story of Gadaw is one where there is so much, related to it. Gadaw represents as you look at kind of the landscape of Guam in folkloric terms, in terms of legends and stories of the past, you see all of these breaks, right? You see all of these points at which the connection to the past is severed, because of colonization, because of times when the Spanish displaced Chamorros, when they forcibly prevented them from practicing things, when they burnt canoes, when they removed people from this land, this island, forced them to live over there, and so on. And so Godao is one of those stories, though, which offers some potential because the people of Inalåhan was a village. The southern part of the island of Guam was a place where the people were allowed to stay. The northern part of Guam was cleared because of the reduction after the Chamorro-Spanish Wars, but the southern part of Guam remained populated. And so a story like this is interesting because it makes you wonder if it does have some potential, whole if it isn't just a simple story, a simple fun story, created for dramatic effect, but if it does mean something, if there is something deeper to it, um just be in especially because of the fact that Inalåhan is a place in which it's possible that the people may have deeper ties there, whereas if you are a family living in villages in the center and the north, your ties may go back a few generations. They may not go back very far. And so and so there's a lot here. And part of it too is because there's lots of stories of Godao. This is not the only story of Godao. Um, and some of those stories are older. They go back to stories that, people who would be the great great grandparents of today would have told, and it makes you wonder if these were stories that they might have heard from their great grandparents and when they were young, or if these were just stories that people made using Godao and then being creative with them. It's something to think about and consider. But for the last story, the last legend that I want to share, though, it actually connects to the Godao story or the Godao legend, because one of the things that I always like to remind people about is that Gadao's legend is is not really just Gadao's legend, is that it is a story that Gadao's name is attached to, but it's actually a story that is told and documented in many ways with other names attached to it. And sometimes Gadao is not mentioned at all, and sometimes other villages are mentioned. And sometimes, as we're about to see, Inalåhan is mentioned, but Gadao is not mentioned. And so remember what I was just saying about how the story of Gadao and the two chiefs, that this could be something deeper, that it could go back further. It's possible, because the truth is that there are other documented legends or stories of villages and Maga'låhi of villages challenging each other. And one of the things that's interesting, though, is that sometimes these stories have the same elements. And so, for example, this is part of a series of Chamorro legends, and that was collected by Hans Hornbostel and his wife Trudis Aleman in the 1920s in Guam. And what's important is about this collection from them is that they were collected in the Chamorro language, because Hans Hornbostel's wife was able to speak Chamorro fluently, and so she could write them down and edit them. Whereas there's older documented Chamorro legends, but it's hard to find them written in the Chamorro language. I mean, there are older ones than the Hornbostel folklore legends, and there are ones that are older, but they tend to be mentioned in English, or they're paraphrased in English. They're very rarely like this, in which this is possibly a Chamorro person recounting it in their native language. But so this is from Hornbostel, and this is from the Hornbostel collection. And so if you are, the originals are in the Bishop Museum. Copies of these field notes of these archives are in the Micronesian Area Research Center, and so you can see them there. But this is the legend of the battle between Quiroga and Talagi. Humano si Quiroga, tauto talefofo. Ha'aligaw si Talagi, tauto Inalåhan. Humano loque si Talagi, ha'aliligaw si Quiroga, para umumu. Ileknya si Quiroga, para manu hao. Ileknya si Talagi, hu'aliligaw hao, para tamumu. Ileknya si Quiroga, nihitahano zatafalaki lansu, zatafansotsu, za adzunai tamumu. Ileknya si Quiroga, and I esta parumasa nenkano, suli idzuni nidzuk. Zahatsuli ipentan, zahafugu si Quiroga ipentan, zakulang hakamzu. Pues umasodzo idos, zamalakas padzoa gitelai zuus, mapus si padzoa, ha'aligo si padzaknya. Man dinilalak si talagi, zan Quiroga, man inatnyao. And so, all right, now this, okay, this does not have the now when you are okay, so when we look at this, first off, according to Hornbostel's notes, this came from a Chamorro man from the village of Hågat, Agate, who was over 100 years old, a Lizama. And and so remember that these types of stories, what are they told for? Number one, um, these types of stories, the Godao story was written down by Francisco Lujan in poetic form and then translated by a team of translators to be an epic poem. Was this recited or repeated for the same purpose, or was it more for fun? Was it for sort of a kid's bedtime story? Was it for sort of the silliness, the playfulness of it, right? So this is where understanding the nature of legends and why they're told can be helpful, because what you think about a legend and what you wish it would be told for, the gravity or the weight that you might put into it, may have nothing to do with sort of how a Chamorro 100 years ago may have felt about it. And so thinking about something like this, one thing that we do know, of course, is that Chamorros tended to tell stories, and you can see a little bit of it here, in which wordplay and fun, having fun, saying fun things was part of it. So that rather than sort of like focusing on the epicness of it or the coherency of it, if you told a story which was ridiculous, but you got to say funny things, you got to make people laugh, or it was ridiculous, but it had this hysterical harmony to it, then your purpose was achieved. And that's a legitimate reason for telling these types of legends and stories. And Chamorro's told those types of stories. This could be part of that, but Hornbostel's notes actually indicate that there may have been something deeper, because he says that actually looking at the places in it. So it says that Quiroga is from Talefofo, Talagi is from Inalåhan, and Padzoa and so on. But actually, even in Guam 100 years ago, there was a place called Askiroga. There, there's a place called Talagi. Aspadzoa was a place. And so, interestingly enough, remember that As means that it's the place of somebody. And so, is this is this meant to be? Is is this a legend that is meant to explain who the people are behind the place names, right? Because remember that around the island of Guam today, there are places where they're called As and then a name. And sometimes people remember who the person is. And sometimes they don't remember who the person is. And so after enough time has passed, if people don't pass down who this is for, right? Do you think people would just kind of make it up? Or do you think a convenient story might emerge to explain where the name comes from? And so it does make you wonder, is this a story that's just meant to, personify, to give like shape and form to all these places, to imagine that because Chamorros say As, and this is the place of that person, that in the past, each of these locations, there was a warrior or a chief or somebody who had this place. Now, is this Chamorros who are imagining that past, or is this tied to something that actually existed in the past? Is this a part of a tradition of great stories from the past? We don't know. We don't know. But it's fascinating to think about. Um, and so for me it's interesting to consider because too often we get stuck on focusing like that, looking for the simplicity of our stories. Oh, it's before the Spanish, it's this or it's that, and it's like no, 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 no. The truth is rarely there. The truth is in the complexity, the complicated nature of stories like this. And the truth may be difficult and the truth may not be known, but we can still hunt for it. We can still look for it. And so, yeah, so the next time you hear the Gadao story, remember that it's very possible that Gadao is not necessarily like a singular sort of powerful figure from our past, but that he may have just been one of many figures, and that this was part of a tradition of sort of songs or stories in which sort of great chiefs or great warriors from across the island did battles, and that poets and storytellers from different corners of the island created these tales, and that in these tales there was particular ways in which you know particular metaphors, similes, commonly understood, like a grammar to it, a way in which they could indicate the power of somebody. And part of it was, right, the squeezing of the coconut, that somebody who did not have to take great pains to hegao, to use the hegao or the kamzu to extract sort of the what is needed from the coconut, but could simply use their power to get it out. And that this was some primordial, basic, fundamental metaphor for the Chamorro people in terms of expressing somebody's power. Now, could it could have been ancient, or it could have been something that Chamorros looking back to their past, that this is something that they imagined. Who knows? It's just cool. It's just cool. Zahu esticia. Gof zahu esticia. Now, I hope that you have found this interesting. And remember, and Genzamo Esticia, if you love to learn about Chamorro legends and more about Guam history, then please consider signing up for uh, Patreon to support Fanachu as a patron on Patreon. Patreon.com/Fanachu. For $1, you can get at least a free t-shirt, free stickers. For $10 or more a month, you get access to the Secret Guam podcast, Radical Readings, and then you can get deep dives, full-on lectures talking about Guam history, legends, all sorts of fun stuff like that. But si Zeus Masino Hamzo Todos, este gi ifanakpo para este na episode Fanachu. Adios, este ki mana Lihenden.